heard about ghosts in the Tower of London or crop circles discovered in the English countryside, but those stories are pretty tame compared to some UK legends. Today, we're talking about two very creepy figures of British folklore. Welcome to Shadowland, everybody.
Welcome.
This is a podcast that shines a spotlight on stories of the supernatural, mysterious, eerie, and unexplained. Stuff like crop circles,
Skinwalkers,
past lives,
shapeshifters,
prophecies,
shaman.
national park disappearances.
Nice. Shadow people.
I really want to do that one.
Gnomes,
Urban legends,
wendigos, all that stuff
all that stuff.
and more. And
Definitely more.
Definitely more. And I'm Seth Jablon,
I'm Christina Callery.
and today we're talking about figures from English folklore, right?
Yes, two creepy,
Two
different figures in English folklore, and it's not your standard, ghosts in the Tower of London or anything like that.
Yes, these are. Well, I'm not sure which one you're doing, but the one I'm doing is weird, and I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm not sure if it might be more well known, obviously in the UK, or probably both of ours are. But
I'm sure. But I'd never heard of mine, so
yeah. Cool. So let's see. Who should go first?
Well, why don't you go first? Because I went first last time.
Okay. Okay. Cool. All right. So I guess you ready to get into it?
I'm totally ready.
Okay. Cool. All right. So my story is the story of Springheel Jack.
Ooh, good one.
Yeah. So Springheel Jack or Heeled Jack, I feel like it's spelled both ways, but he's an entity in English folklore from the Victorian era. So just a brief description of him before we get into sort of the nitty gritty of his stories. He was often described as tall and thin, with a prominent nose, pointed ears, and bony fingers that resemble claws or metal claws.
Metal claws?
What's that?
Metal claws.
Metal claws, yes.
Okay.
Cold and steely.
Okay. Like a James Bond villain.
Yes, exactly. And he was often described as devilish in appearance. He had eyes that resembled red balls of fire. He wore a long cloak that sort of hid him often, and then he would sort of open it up when he would scare people. And underneath he would have this close-fitting garment made of a glittering material. It was often described as oilskin or metal mesh. He also wore a helmet.
Wait. Huh? It was glittering?
Glittering, yeah. Some of the reports,
okay.
It was basically that it was shining, right? And so people
so it was like a disco ghoul.
Yeah, so people would say like oil skin, but I think that was like maybe the closest thing. I mean, there's definitely there's definitely something to discuss there, right? Because this is from a time where there wasn't, space helmets and, latex, right? But it's often described in odd terms because it was sort of hard to tell what it was. But it was definitely something glittering or shiny or metallic. And his helmet was also appeared to be made from the same material. He often carried a lamp of some sort that people often described as strapped to his chest, right? So he would have it sort of under his cloak. And then there were some later...
Like an oil lamp or...
Yeah, exactly. Like an oil lamp or some kind of lamp that was sort of like affixed to his chest. And there were some later descriptions that he carried a ray gun, but that shot blue flames out. But very often these encounters he would have with people, he would shoot blue flames from his mouth or his eyes. It was varying degrees of where it was coming from, but and they would like paralyze people or make them have seizures and things like that. He got his name Springheel Jack because he would often leap over high walls to get away after he would surprise or attack people. And he was also said to have been able to clear a road in a single bound. And on one occasion, he completely leapt over a covered wagon. So that's just sort of an overview of the character.
Whoa.
This is all sort of an amalgamation of a number of different sightings and police reports from the time period. So the first alleged sightings of Springheel Jack were made in London between 1837 and 1838. So these are probably the most famous ones that I think really began the legend. So prior to a number of these famous reports, he was already sort of known in London and in the area around there that there was this, ghostly figure or cloak wrapped figure that would hop out of nowhere, scare people, and then hop away. Right. That was like the general description. Sometimes he was said to have he would reveal a sort of horrible face to people, and then sometimes he would have these like glowing eyes, and sometimes he would shoot flames.
So you want to say a horrible face, like vicious, or just terrifying to look at?
I think it was terrifying to look at. Like I said, some people described him as having devilish. So I imagine, if you saw somebody in the gaslight of 1800s London, and they looked like devilish, that would probably be pretty terrifying. But some people also described him as having a gentlemanly appearance. So there's some sort of mixed perceptions of what he actually looked like in the face, but what he wore and how he acted was generally consistent. So one of the most famous reports of Springheel Jack was made by Mary Stevens in October 1837. So she was a servant girl, and one night she was walking through Clapham Common alone late at night. And so she said a man sort of jumped out from this dark alley, grabbed her tightly, kissed her, tried to rip off her clothes.
Kissed her?
Yeah, kissed her. Ripped off or ripped at her clothes with these metal claws that she described as cold and clammy as those of a corpse. She managed to escape, and then when others tried to help locate her or attack her, they couldn't find him. The day after the incident with Mary Stevens, a man described as matching his appearance was seen near her house. When people started to pursue him, he jumped in the way of a carriage passing by, and the driver actually drove off the road, actually getting hurt pretty badly himself. Then the creature escaped by jumping over a 9-foot wall. So you can see where his sort of Springheel Jack name came from. One of my friends actually has said he thinks it was some guy who was actually really good at parkour, but the way that people describe the way he jumps is definitely like a supernatural quality, right? Like sort of how the Mothman doesn't actually flap his wings to fly. He would just sort of like bound over these walls.
Almost like levitating or something.
Yeah, exactly. So that was one of the first reports. The next big one was in February 20th, 1838. And that was the Jane Alsop assault. So this happened when Jane Alsop was living with her father and two sisters on Beerbind Lane. This was outside the village of Old Ford in the East End of London. One night, Alsop was home and she hears this like loud knocking at the front gate. So she goes to find out what the noise is about and found a man standing there in the shadows. The man told her he was a police officer and to go bring him a light because he had actually captured the infamous Springheel Jack, right? And so this is about a year of these sightings going on. So she was pretty excited. Everybody, I think at that point, maybe knew who Springheel Jack was. So she goes to run for a light for the policeman. She comes back, and as soon as she hands the light to him, he throws his cloak off and holds the candle to his chest. And so in that light, she sees what she calls his hideous appearance. She said his eyes were like red balls of fire. He wore a large helmet, a white oilskin suit, and he vomited out blue and white flames. So Alsop screams and tries to get away, but the man grabs her by the head and began to rip at her chest and body with what she said felt like an iron claw. She was able to free herself and run to the door, but the attacker caught up with her. Luckily, her father and sister were now at the door and were actually trying to pull her inside as the attacker continued to sort of claw at her face and tore out patches of her hair. So this is a pretty brutal assault, really.
Yeah.
So they get her inside, they shut the door, and the attacker...
And there were witnesses.
There's witnesses, and the attacker actually stays banging at the door until Alsop's sister shouted out of the upstairs windows for a policeman. And so that's when Springheel Jack leapt away back into the shadows. So they report all this to the police. There's an investigation. I guess there was, apparently in some other accounts where they went on sort of interviewed people around the areas. They said another person may have come up to retrieve Jack's cloak, which he had dropped when he ran off. So that's like a weird detail to the story that maybe he wasn't alone. But I think this might have been one of the first accounts of Jack actually having hurt somebody rather than just scaring him, right? He was running around London, jumping out of nowhere, but now he's like tearing at people.
It's escalating.
The next one actually happened days later on February 28th, 1838, and that was the Lucy Scales assault. So on February 28th, an 18-year-old Lucy Scales and her sister were walking home from their brother's house. It was around 8:30 in the evening, and the two of them were walking through Green Dragon Alley, which kind of sounds like you're asking for trouble. sounds kind of crazy. When they saw a cloaked figure standing in the alley up ahead. So as Lucy came close, the figure threw open its cloak, and there at his chest he had a lantern fixed, and he spurted blue flames into her face. This sent her into a swoon, and she collapsed and actually started having a seizure. So Lucy's sister now is trying to like hold on to her and keep her safe. And she watches as the assailant just walks away like nonchalantly. So they must have still been close to the brother's house because he was actually able to hear their screams. I guess they had just left. So he comes running to see what happens. He scoops them up, brings them both back home. Lucy didn't really see much, like when he flashed the lantern, it kind of stunned her. But the sister describes the attacker as tall, thin, and gentlemanly in appearance, and that he's wearing a large cloak, and then also carrying a small lantern similar to what the police carried, which they called a bullseye. So I think that was the type of lantern or something that looked like that he had sort of attached to his chest. So those were like some of the bigger, more well-known reports, or at least well-documented ones, because they went to the police about them. But there continued to be sort of sightings of him, attacks, things like this. Definitely started snowballing. I think so. There was lots of. He basically became an urban legend after a while, right? And there was lots of different, theories about who or what it was. Right? Some people thought it was a ghost. Some people thought it was a prankster. The suspicion eventually focused on the Marquis of Waterford, Henry de la Poor Beresford. I guess I'm going to say Beresford. He was sort of
good enough.
Yeah, he was sort of like a upper crust sort of gentleman type, but he was like into drinking and jokes and
jumping really high.
He was super into parkour. And he owned a spring factory. No, I'm just kidding. But he was also known to have sort of contempt for women, and so there was a lot of theories going around that this was like some sort of wager about scaring women or something like that. But definitely, all the theories about him all seem, hard to explain, hard to fit, right? Just because of all the like very unnatural characteristics of whatever this thing was. Granted, this was a long time ago. Who knows what actually happened? But there are a lot of weird details captured in these police reports, right? But definitely as time, passed, in England, he became more of a folklore figure. I mean, I imagine something like the road troll that we talked about, right? Where this thing sort of takes on a life of its own.
Right.
He was later connected to UFO sightings by Jay Viner in the Flying Saucer Review.
Mm-hmm.
I think
the Flying Saucer Review?
Yeah, no, I want a copy of it. I think it was like in the 50s or something.
Subscribe.
What's that?
I want to subscribe.
Yeah, totally. But the notion,
I was gonna say, like, the whole, like, the description, it sounds like a hybrid, sort of a mashup of all these different kind of creatures, the cryptids and so forth. And I mean, he's like part ghoul, ghost, part alien with a ray gun.
yeah, totally. I mean, I think the sort of glowing red eyes is an interesting thing, right? It kind of reminds me of the Mothman, and also the like ability to sort of like spring over things. I also just think the descriptions of his clothing is also really odd. Like, just the fact that, like, I mean, he's wearing a helmet, right? Like, so when you think in the 1800s, they didn't have crash helmets or, like
Right.
the helmets that they had were battle helmets, right? Like for knights and stuff like that, right? They weren't flying planes and all this stuff. So just that's pretty odd. And just the cape and all these things. It's this like weird sort of hybrid. And that's why it's like with Mothman, it seems such an odd construction that like you feel like it must be based on something, right? Something happens, whether it was some like cool steampunk,
Time
traveler or something like that. I don't know what it was, but Jay Viner, he writes about a report that I think is perhaps largely unsubstantiated, but he reported that on July 6, 1838, Inspector Hemner of the Liverpool Police was patrolling the boundary of a park on horseback when he witnessed a flash of what he called lightning that drew his attention to a great ball of fire that was hanging motionless over a nearby field. So for about 2 minutes, that ball simply hung there in place, and then it emitted showers of brilliant sparks, and then sunk into the ground and disappeared, right?
Oh.
So again, who knows, like, first of all, did this actually happen? Second of all, was this some weird ball lightning thing where then it was just connected to Springheel Jack just because...
Swamp gas?
Was it swamp gas? But it's interesting. Some other people, including him, were, try to connect him to events that happened in America, or at least pull some parallels. I think, there's definitely some, interest in having him be an alien with some people. But I read one article, I think it was on Mysterious Universe, maybe that, there was that someone went and sort of dug through some fire-breathing ghosts and activity like that in America. So I'm just going to read a couple of them because there's just some interesting commonalities here.
Fire-breathing ghosts?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Apparently it's a thing.
Okay, I didn't know it was a thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, originally, like I said, people thought he was some type of ghost, right? They didn't really have like aliens and stuff back then, right? Too much. Like, I think there was, some reports of that, but it was like a hard concept. So a lot of paranormal activity was often like, that's a ghost, right? So,
right.
1885, in Long Island, there was the fire spitting ghost. And this was a specter with a tongue of fire that continued to reappear in the old Centerville racecourse. So around 10 o'clock, it would appear, and then it would depart at 12 minutes after 11, like on sort of like clockwork. There was a dispute whether the ghost wore a robe of white or a garment the color of sheep's wool, but there was another point that there was no disagreement, and that was...
It's like a fine point, though.
It is a fine point. But everyone agreed that the ghost would spit fire like a foundry chimney, and it would leave a sulfurous
I would
odor
focus on
behind
that.
Focus on the fire breathing part, right?
Yeah.
Not
the shades. It was kind of an ecru, kind of.
Yeah. No, it was more of a cream. So then it would sort of zigzag off, right? So that was the fire spitting ghost of Long Island. In 1897, there was the leaping ghost, and this was a ghost that would leap around with a lantern in Auburn, New York. Apparently, hundreds of people saw this thing over a number of nights. And similar to the other ghosts, it would appear at a certain hour at 1 o'clock. And it was tall, clothed in white, and it would carry a lantern. And people would describe it as bounding like a kangaroo, rising from the center of the oat field.
Sounds kind of fun.
It does sound kind of fun. But I guess it would bound towards them, which maybe was not so fun. But it was a figure of a man clothed entirely in white, and it would swing a lantern in its hand. And then lastly was there's actually a bunch more of these, but the Devil in Black in Georgetown, Delaware. And this was a man more than 7 feet in height in a long black cloak that followed young women and young girls and jumped out from behind trees and sort of scared them. And he was said to have a, devilish like appearance or devil-like face. So these are all examples of, things that people have sort of connected to Springheel Jack or it's reminiscent of it, which is kind of crazy, right? It's kind of weird. Like this was, these reports definitely happened, right? In
right.
the 1800s in America, not long after some of the stuff that was happening in England. And who knows, maybe it was like, people's read some in a newspaper and blah, blah, blah. But there was definitely there's some sort of phenomenon where people think they see a devilish type of character jumping around, spitting flames.
You're right. The jumping around part is the thing that stands out to me too. And the flames, the spitting flames. I mean, I can see the cloak. Cloaks are scary. Everybody wore cloaks also.
Yeah, right.
But the jumping around.
Or you think about like devils like in flames, it's like, okay. But yeah, the jumping around, it's like, if it's like, ooh, describe something really scary to me, you wouldn't be like, okay, it can totally jump over fences, right? It doesn't sound scary. It sounds fun, right?
No, like kind of like gliding is more scary.
Like gliding,
sudden,
right? Exactly.
Intense
appearing
movements.
And disappearing.
Yeah, I don't know.
Floating, but like jumping really high just doesn't sound that menacing.
Just like bounding. It comes bounding toward you.
Right. I mean, the iron claw sounds pretty crazy.
That is scary. I mean, the iron claw is scary.
Yeah. I mean, and then the whole like extraterrestrial thing, like Jay Viners that said that, he believed there was some sort of stranded extraterrestrial or something that was coming around, just like seeing what was up, like, I don't know. But I also like the theory that it's like some aristocrat with like hella steampunk gear.
Right.
Around London,
right. Like he's got some really advanced jumping technology.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So that's the Legend of Springheel Jack.
Wow, that was great. I hadn't heard a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
what do you think? What's your favorite theory?
Okay, I want to believe that it's some sort of like weird extraterrestrial that's just like, either got a real chip on his shoulder or just doesn't know how to like talk to women.
Right. Super awkward.
I feel like it probably is some like crazy steampunk guy or something like that. Or maybe there's just some type of fire-breathing ghost we don't know about yet. But there was some sort of, it's definitely a phenomena, right? Like, even if this was all in people's minds, I want to know why. Why would this be in your mind, right? Like we were just talking about, like, why would we
question.
Dream up this character? It's such an odd character.
Well, there's a grain of truth in there. There's got to be.
There's got to be something.
All of these reports and then eyewitnesses. So,
but you think about this, like,
what was it?
Right. Like, what if it was a person, they just had like built this like crazy apparatus that like shot gas flames out and like made his eyes spin red, and like maybe he did have like cool like springs on his like shoot him like a little jetpack, like
I think
shoot him.
Elon Musk is working on that.
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like this stuff would be hard to do now. Like, so it's very hard to think that this was some type of apparatus at the time, but I don't know. Maybe it's a combo. Maybe it was some like steampunk alien or something like that. I don't know.
Could be.
Steampunk ghost. That was time traveling ghost or something.
I went to a steampunk haunted house once.
You did, really?
I did.
Where was that?
In New York.
In New York?
Yeah.
Was it scary?
It wasn't super scary. It was more like experiential.
Okay,
you kind of like wander into rooms, and it was just more about the ambience. And,
I can see that.
The actors and the costumes and all that.
Yeah, I mean, steampunk, it just doesn't sound sort of scary,
No.
right off the jump. But I don't know. Who knows? Maybe there's some scary I mean, this is kind of a scary steampunk story.
It is scary. I mean, the red eyes and the
Yeah, the red
clawing
eyes
at
and
you with the metal.
flames.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
So
Okay.
you ready to do your story?
I'm ready to do mine.
I'm dying to
Okay.
know what you're doing.
Okay. So I'm doing the Highgate vampire,
Ooh.
which is kind of a contemporary vampire.
Okay.
I was actually pretty surprised when I was doing research about it. So just real quickly, the Highgate Cemetery in London is one of what is known as the Magnificent Seven cemeteries in London. And basically, these were established in the 19th century because of overcrowding and the smaller parish burial grounds.
So these were like mega or very
Kind of
large.
mega, yeah, like
Okay.
mega cemeteries. So it was opened in 1839. It's very beautiful and large, and it's the final resting place of Karl Marx,
Oh, really?
famously,
Huh.
and novelist George Eliot. And it has all of these incredible, like, Gothic busts and tombstones, and it's a place of great beauty. And it's now also a nature reserve.
Hmm.
But so in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the cemetery had fallen into disrepair. So the site was in ruins, mausoleums and crypts were overgrown, headstones were crumbling, and the graveyard was a frequent target of vandals, which is really sad. And then horrifically, and I found this really hard to believe, but apparently bones could sometimes be seen, like
Oh,
spilling out
crazy.
of coffins that had been
Right.
set on
Right.
fire. I mean, so like when we're talking about vandals, it's not just like, oh, I'm going to put my initials here. It's, hardcore people, defiling grave sites and so forth.
Right. Whoa.
Yeah, so like even more horrifically, there were corpse mutilations and even apparently killings of small animals.
Whoa. Like from like weird
Well,
ritualistic stuff, or just like people out there.
yeah, yeah. So apparently people thought like that there were, Satanists or, some kind of like weird occult activity happening. Witnesses reported seeing robed men conducting strange rituals in the
Whoa.
cemetery.
Whoa.
So amidst all of this desecration, a series of strange sightings were reported in the local newspaper, the Hampstead and Highgate Express. And described a very tall, again, this is very similar to yours,
Okay.
actually. So it's a very tall man wearing a black cloak with a tall black hat. He was described as gaunt and pale with red eyes and an incredibly haunting stare.
Whoa.
People, yeah. So he didn't jump though. People said that he seemed to kind of like float more than walk and sort of like gliding over the ground, like his feet weren't touching it. So here are just a few of the accounts. Former military officer Brian Bourne claims to have encountered an apparition on Swains Lane. He was walking with his dog at the time, and he said, as we proceeded along the cemetery's outer wall, I became uncomfortably aware of a curious silence. All the birds had stopped singing. I was 10 yards from the north gate when I happened to look across it. What I saw was what appeared to be black treacle flowing down and running over the wall. The path was in shadow, but there was a shadow discernible within that shadow. I'd estimate its height at between 7 or 8 feet. It was neither solid nor transparent. My overall impression was that it was a black figure wearing dark garments which flowed and stirred in the wind. But there was no wind. The edges of what it was wearing were moving. No face, where eyes would have been, if it were human, were just 2 red pits, like red glows. The next thing I recall, I found myself up against the wall at the top of Swains Lane. The dog had beaten me there. I have no recollection of running, but I must have done. Which sounds a lot like alien abduction stories, right?
What's that? The like
That he's forgetting,
losing
like the
time or
lapse in
whatever.
time.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so then another one, a plant nursery worker, Michael Quinn, saw, quote, the figure of a darkly dressed man who looked like he was wearing a top hat through the north gate of the West Cemetery. The figure lingers in mist approximately 15 feet from the gate before fading away. And then another man referred to as Thornton said he had been, quote, hypnotized by something in the cemetery after he had gone there late one afternoon to look around. And then he said, as the light began to fail, he decided to leave, but somehow he became hopelessly lost. Not being a superstitious person or even believing in the existence of ghosts, he walked calmly around looking for the gate when he suddenly became aware of the presence of something behind him. Swinging around less than 6 feet away, he saw a tall, dark specter hovering just above the ground. He found himself transfixed to the spot, completely unable to move, drained of energy by some powerful hypnotic force that in a matter of seconds rendered him unconscious to any sense of time or his surroundings. So great was the intensity of this force that he remained like this for several minutes, or what seemed like several minutes, before the specter abruptly vanished and he slowly regained his normal faculties.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
These are kind of scary.
Well, yeah, I know. It is. It's pretty creepy.
And why
So
is everybody walking around this cemetery?
the cemetery at night? Yeah, I know.
I mean, I guess it's like Greenwood,
Like,
where it's like I'm sure people
it was
like
kind of
walk
like
their dogs
pre-goth era too. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, in the '80s,
like
I could, in the '90s, I could see it, but
yeah.
So recalling the incident afterwards, Thornton said that it was almost as if some force of terribly evil proportions had actually sought him out with the intention of doing serious harm. And the person that actually wrote this, I'll get to in a minute, because he's like a major figure in the Highgate Cemetery vampire stories.
The guy who's writing this story.
The guy who wrote that past account that I just read. Okay. So there was another witness report. They saw a black figure entering a vault and a trail of blood leading to the tomb. Two further witnesses apparently saw an apparition rise from the ground and move with, quote, incredible speed and swift in long strides. And then there was like an older woman who claimed she had been frightened by a, quote, tall, dark man who floated at her from within the cemetery gates. And she'd been walking her dog late at night, but as she approached the gates, the dog started to howl and tried to retreat, and she looked up and then she saw a figure with, quote, glaring eyes staring at her, and then it suddenly vanished. Okay, so with all of these stories piling up, this figure came to be called the Highgate vampire, because it's all taking place in the Highgate Cemetery. And then...
But what's the vampire part? Or maybe you're getting into that.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I'll get to that.
Okay. I get the Highgate part. But
Right. Well, I think some of it has to do with the fact that it's in a cemetery, and so it's like undead.
Right.
Something coming out of a grave. So as these stories made their way to the public, hundreds of people began showing up to the cemetery, hoping to catch a glimpse of this creature. But these included a couple of actual vampire hunters that sound like something out of a Victorian Gothic novel. So a group called the British Psychic and Occult Society, headed up by a man named David Ferrant, he was like 24 years old at the time. So this group took it upon itself to investigate the creature. So Ferrant claimed that on Christmas Eve in 1969, he saw a tall gray figure floating in the cemetery. And then shortly afterward, he'd come across foxes in the area who had their throats slit.
Whoa.
Which really makes me sad.
Yeah.
But anyway, here's part of his account. And he's the one that had written that one case above. So he said, suddenly something caught my eye, and looking up just inside, not 5 yards from the gate and clearly visible, was a tall, dark shape. Instinctively, my conscious mind rejected this figure as being supernatural. It was more consoling to assume that it was somebody wandering through the cemetery, notwithstanding that the figure appeared to be over 7 feet tall. Any immediate doubts were soon dispelled. Its reddish eyes meeting my gaze from a black mass at the top of the shape, which I took to be its head. But these eyes were not human, rather reflected some, quote, alive presence. They were dull and penetrating, like some hungry wolf, although the rest of it had no discernible features apart from a vague human shape. The whole situation seemed unreal, like some unwanted dream. But with determined effort, I tore my gaze away, realizing that the entity was malevolent and that I had come under psychic attack.
Wow.
Without warning, the figure then suddenly vanished, and it appeared that for the moment, at least, the entity had retreated. Okay, but that's not the end of the story, by a long shot. Okay. So basically, he decides this needs to be investigated further. And so one night, he and the members of his group descended upon the cemetery and created a, quote, protective circle, hoping to invoke this vampire or creature, whatever it is. But before things could really take off, the cops showed up and everybody scattered. Police arrested
Sounds like
Farron.
high school.
Yeah, kind of like high school. So police, arrested the ringleader, Farron, and found that he was carrying a cross and a wooden stake. So he was like super old school about it. You can pretty much guess what he was going to use that for.
Right.
And he was quoted as saying, "Had the police not arrived, I would have entered the catacombs and inspected the coffins. Upon finding the supernatural being, I would have driven a stake through its heart and then run away." He also said he was, quote, aware of the power of the cross.
I love how metal this group is. This group of people is like, they're out there like,
it's super metal. Okay. So, but he's arrested and he's taken away. And the next morning he appeared in court for going into an enclosed area for an unlawful purpose, but the charges didn't stick. And he was released because basically the cemetery was open to the public 24 hours a day. They couldn't really hold him on anything.
Breaking and entering.
Yeah. So this group was the vampire. Not only were there various grave desecrations carried out by the mob that had come to watch, a man named Sean Manchester of the British Occult Society was said to be investigating the matter in 1967. Manchester also called himself a bishop, but it's, in my research, it's not really clear which church he was a bishop of, and he's made some pretty interesting claims. So he said that he encountered several girls who came away with the telltale puncture marks on their necks after they'd gone to the cemetery.
So this is the vampire.
Here, it gets more vampire-y. Okay. So a few of them were apparently sleepwalking at the time. One of them allegedly tried to go back to the cemetery, and Manchester saved her by throwing a crucifix in her path. And then he decided he was going to get the job done once and for all. So he announced to the media that he was going to take care of the vampire, and hundreds of people showed up to watch, including the police. But despite all these witnesses there and the cops there, Manchester and some accomplices made a hole in the roof of a tomb, which they entered only to find 3 empty coffins. So obviously they put garlic and holy water in them and surrounded each coffin with a circle of salt. However, that didn't stop the vampires. So the craziness continued. At one point, the body of a woman, basically a corpse from the cemetery, was found in the middle of a cemetery path. She'd been beheaded and a stake driven through her heart.
Jesus. I
know. And then in 1970, Manchester wrote a book called The Highgate Vampire. So Farron, not to be outdone, put out his own book called Beyond the Highgate Vampire, and the two were kind of like dueling vampire hunters, and they had this professional rivalry that lasted basically their whole lives. And so they would sort of one-up and taunt each other in the press coverage. Like For example, after Farron's unsuccessful hunt, Manchester was like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to lead a vampire hunt every single night." So he like tells the press, "I'm going to be there every night and catch this vampire."
Right.
So basically, they wanted to be the one to kill the vampire. So Manchester's take on this being was that it was a king vampire who had been a medieval black magician who had practiced magic in Wallachia, home of the OG Dracula, like in Romania,
Right.
Vlad Dracul or whatever. And apparently he was running around because a Satanist had resurrected him, and he now walked the cemetery at night. It was carte blanche, you know.
Right.
Then in 1973, Manchester said that he found this king vampire in an abandoned house in Highgate. He and his assistant dragged the casket outside, opened the lid, and said that inside the casket there were, quote, burning fierce eyes beneath black furrowed brows that stared with hellish reflection. They were yellow at the edges with a blood red center.
Wow.
Unlike any other beast of prey. So you've got like your red eyes again.
Right, the red eyes.
So at this point, he claimed that he drove a wooden stake through the vampire's heart, at which point it let out a horrible scream and his body turned into brown slime.
Okay. I guess that's what happened to vampires.
Yeah, I know. That is what happened to. I mean, haven't you seen what is it?
The brown slime thing. I thought they like I don't know turned into dust or something.
The brown slime thing. Well, what is it? It's not Freaky Friday. I'm getting this mixed.
Freaky Friday. Freaky Friday, isn't that where they like switch bodies or something? I don't know.
No. It's with Jodie Foster. No, not that one. It's
I just totally made that up.
I'm gonna remember it in a second.
Okay, it's okay.
Okay, it's Fright Night.
Fright Night. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like Fright Night. Okay. So he claims that he killed the king vampire.
Right.
But conveniently, the casket, they burned it. So there's no evidence left of that, and they didn't record it. They were too freaked out, so of course they didn't get any sort of recording of that either. But then in 1974, David Farron was arrested again after damaging a memorial and interfering with a dead body. I don't know exactly what he did then, but he was also in possession of a firearm. But the vampire craze basically came to an end in 1975 when a conservation group called the Friends of Highgate Cemetery was created. They cleaned up the cemetery, they installed new gates, they reinterred the remains that had been dug up and were just kind of hanging out there. And today it's once again a peaceful place of rest.
Wow.
But that doesn't mean vampire sightings have completely gone away. Okay. As recent as 2016, reports continued to surface. And the feud between the two major vampire hunters continued on through the years. And apparently Farron was involved in the creation of a line of comics called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, which was a swipe at Manchester. And then also he had merch. There were like Bishop Bonkers mugs and t-shirts. And then meanwhile, Manchester wrote blogs accusing Farron of having narcissistic personality disorder. And he also kind of included these illustrations of him as a demon.
Okay.
So Farron seemed to have more of a sense of humor than Manchester. Manchester made several complaints against radio stations based on, stuff that they said in the air. 2 of them were upheld and involved his status as a bishop, either not being addressed or questioned. And the third one, which I find pretty hilarious, was after a 2006 comment in a discussion about the Highgate vampire in which Manchester and others were called 1970s weirdos. But that comment was upheld as a fair description.
Okay.
And then, sadly, David Farron passed away in April of 2019. In addition to being remembered as a vampire hunter, he was one of the only 2 people to be jailed for witchcraft in the 20th century.
Wow, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, I had no idea. And then Manchester, though, he posted some kind words about him that close with, quote, "Though he might not want my prayers, he has them anyway. May he rest in peace."
Wow, okay. So this sort of turned into a saga of these 2 dueling...
the 2 feuding vampire hunters, yeah. Yeah. So that's the story of the Highgate vampire.
Cool. So it sounds, I mean, like with, it sounds like it was this like kind of whatever. I mean, there was definitely some type of like sighting of some sort of something happening, some shadow person or, and that people were getting they're sort of like, hypnotized or sleepwalking or, it's like almost like sort of like a weird energy vampire or something like that. But it was like specifically maybe it was the vampire hysteria at the time, or it was the one of the...
Yeah, it was kind of like the satanic panic, only it was in the like...
was a vampire or something.
60s, 70s, yeah, the vampire hysteria. Yeah.
Right. That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that story at all.
Yeah, me neither.
Cool. Well, I like how goth this episode was. I'm not sure how intentional.
Super goth.
I'm not sure how intentional that was, but definitely ended up that way.
And they both have the red eyes.
Yeah, I know.
And like the cloak and this. There's something skinny about, like, and yeah.
I feel like there's something in like our collective like consciousness of like, or our id or something, that we fear these like tall, shadowy men, right? Like this like very tall, it's like very Slender Man like, and just
with cloaks and pale and
but the red eyes, like how do you, I mean, I can understand like seeing a shadowy figure and be like, ooh, is that they're wearing a cloak or a long jacket? Like you don't really know, but red glowing eyes, like that's hard to really mistake.
Like makeup, yeah.
Yeah, I mean like even animals and stuff don't really have red. I mean, like I guess you see like an owl or something, they can catch light and reflect it or something. But
right, there's like a reflection, but it's completely different. It's not like a red glowing. No.
So that sticks out to me. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I feel like we really did it for this one. How do you feel?
Feel pretty good.
Good. Okay, cool. So we have another one coming up for maybe like a holiday type episode. Oh, and if you guys are enjoying these, definitely rate and review us on iTunes.
Please do.
Helps. Yep.
5 stars.
5 stars. Yeah. Any great positive comments you want to leave us? Anyways, cool. Well, I guess that should do it.
Yeah, and if you. Yeah, I feel pretty good. And just one other thing, if you guys have any story ideas, anything that you want to see or hear us talk about, send it to shadowlandpodcast@gmail.com.
Cool. All right, so I guess until next time.
All right, talk to you later.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Shadowland Podcast is produced by Seth Jablon and Christina Callaghan. Edited by Tim Kelly. Theme music by Tim Lakin.
Thanks, Tim.